Chapter 31. The preparations had taken 6 hours. 6 hours of frantic work as every flight-worthy spaceship on Exocron was hurriedly fitted out for battle. It took another hour to get the whole ensemble into space, and one more to arrange them into something resembling a combat perimeter. And with that, their estimated 8-hour grace period was over. And now, with the entire Raikos pirate gang on its way, the most pitiful defense fleet Shada had ever seen stood by in trembling readiness to defend its world or die trying. Most likely to die trying. Report from ground, Admiral David, reported from the Wildcard's bridge comm station, looking over at the helm. Supreme Admiral Dar says we all in good position. Also, says air fleet ships ready if pirates get past. Looming over Dankin, his hands clasped stiffly behind his back, Admiral Trey David nodded. Very good, he said, his formal tone nevertheless hinting at a great deal of energy below the surface. Signal the rest of the fleet to be ready. They could be here at any moment. Oh my, 3PO said miserably from beside Shada at the spotting station. I do so hate space combat. I can't argue with you on this one, Shada agreed, looking over her status board. She had wondered at first, wondered with a great deal of suspicion actually, why Admiral David would ask to direct the battle from the Wildcard instead of one of Exocron's own combat ships. But her subsequent assessment of those ships and their capabilities had unfortunately provided her with the answer. 8 hours ago, she had snidely suggested to M2Ni that the Exocron Space Force might find anything more formidable than an occasional smuggler beyond its strength. Never before in her life had one of her offhand comments nailed the truth so accurately. There was a brush of air beside her. It becomes a waiting game now, Card said, kneeling down beside her seat. What do you think? We haven't got a chance, Shada told him bluntly. Not unless Raikos doesn't bother to send anything bigger than the Corsairs he hit us with at Dayark. She thought she'd spoken quietly enough for only Card to hear. David apparently had good ears. No, he'll bring everything he has, the Admiral assured her. His full armada, with himself at the head of it. He's wanted to get his hands on Exocron's wealth for a long time. He smiled tightly. Besides which, I understand from M2Ni that you gave him something of a bruised eye at Dayark. For the revenge part alone, he'd be sure to be here. Shada felt Card's silent sigh as a breath of warm air on her cheek. Which may ultimately give us our only real chance, he said. If we can pretend to start running, we may be able to draw enough of them away for your forces to deal with the rest. Possibly, David agreed. Not that that would do us personally much good, of course. It's my fault he's here, Card reminded him. It's not too late for you to transfer to one of the other ships. At the sensor station, Hisashi suddenly snarled. They come, she announced. 3 Sinar Marauder-class corvettes, 4 Durafirm Disrail-class attack cruisers, 4 combat-modified CSA Etty lighter freighters, and 18 Corsair-class attack vessels. Confirmed, Shada said, running her eyes over her spotting displays, a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. The wild card could take any one of those ships, or give any 2 of them a decent fight. But all of them together... Stand by turbo lasers, Card said, rising to his feet beside her. Turbo lasers standing by, Shada confirmed, keying targeting information over to the 3 weapons stations. Just because it was hopeless didn't mean they shouldn't do their best. Looks like the Corsairs are forming up a screen around the bigger ships. Captain? Chin called from the comm. We getting call from one of the Marauders. You want make him an answer? Shada could feel Card tense. Yes, go ahead, he said. Chin keyed the comm. Hey there, Card, a familiar gloating voice boomed from the bridge speaker. I told you you'd see me again before you died, didn't I? Yes, Zern, you did, Card agreed, his voice betraying none of the tension Shada knew he was feeling. I'm surprised you're still alive after that fiasco at Dayark. Raikos must be going soft in his old age. From the background came a distant flurry of Rhodian invective. Rekos says he'll maybe save you for last for that one, Zern said. You like that, huh? Across the bridge, David cleared his throat. Rekos, this is Admiral Trey David of the Exocron Combined Air Space Fleet, he said. Oh, an admiral, huh? Zern said sarcastically. You mean this collection of scrap rates a whole admiral? You're in violation of Exocron space, David said calmly, ignoring the insult. This is your last chance to withdraw peaceably. Zern laughed. Oh, that's rich. That's really rich. We definitely got to save you for last. Then we can gut you all and feed you to the scavengers. There was another burst of Rhodian. Hey, we gotta go, Card. Time to make the big scrap into lots of little scrap. See you later, Admiral. The comm keyed off. They're sure well stocked in the confidence department, aren't they? Shada murmured. Yes, Card said. His hand brushed past her shoulder, hesitated, then came back almost reluctantly to rest there. I'm sorry, Shada, he said, his voice just loud enough for her to hear. I should never have brought you into this. It's all right, Shada said. So this was it, the end of the long journey. Back at the Orawood Tower, facing the Nogri and their blasters, she had been ready to die. Had almost hoped they would overreact and kill her, in fact. The easy way out, she had thought then. Now, facing the incoming pirates, she realized that there were no easy ways out. No way of dying that didn't involve abandoning a responsibility or leaving necessary work undone. She glanced up at Card, gazing out the viewport, his face set in hard lines. Or indeed, of leaving friends behind. Distantly, she wondered when in all of this she had started to think of Card as a friend. She didn't know, but it didn't matter. What mattered was doing their best to clean up the mess they'd created here. Shifting her attention back to her display, she began tagging primary and secondary targets. The leading ships were almost in range. Signal to all ships, Admiral David announced. Pull back. Repeat. Pull back. Shada flashed him a frown. What? I said pull back, David repeated, flashing an almost curious look at her in return. Which part didn't you understand? Shada started to say something blistering, choked it back as Card squeezed her shoulder warningly. She was thinking about the fact that the wild card isn't as maneuverable close into a gravitational field as it is in open space, he told David. Neither are most of the ships in your fleet. Understood, David said. The order remains. Pull back. Chief? Dankin asked. Shada glanced up again. Card was looking at David, measuring the man with his eyes. Transmit the order, Chin, he said, his tone suddenly thoughtful. Dankin, go ahead and retreat, but keep us in formation with the other ships. Shada, have the gunners lay down covering fire. Right. Shada keyed her intercom, her eyes searching the displays as she tried to figure out what was going on. The usual tactical reason for pulling back towards a planetary surface was to lure an enemy within range of either ground-based weapons or a surface-launched ambush. But every ship Exocron had was already up here, and Asishi's sensor probes would certainly have picked up any ground weaponry powerful enough to reach this far into space. The fleet was beginning to move now, backing towards Exocron as ordered. Some of the armed civilian ships were already firing uselessly at the Corsairs, arrowing silently in at them, wasting energy on out-of-range targets. Shada looked at David, but either he hadn't noticed or didn't especially care what they did. Were the civilians nothing but sacrificial lures to him? Keep retreating, he said instead. All ships. The Corsairs were nearly in range. The larger warships formed up behind them now in a straightforward assault line. Little wonder, considering the opposition. There was no need for them to try anything fancy. A straight slice through the ships arrayed against them, then probably a low strafing loop over Exocron's major population centers, taking out Supreme Admiral Dar's pitiful air fleet along the way. Keep retreating, David said again. Tactical display, please. His Ishi hissed acknowledgement, and the tactical overlay came up. The defenders were all well within Exocron's gravity field now. Far too late for any of them to change their minds and try to escape to hyperspace. Was that what David was going for, Shada wondered? Putting them in a position where they had no choice but to fight to the death? Even as that disturbing thought occurred to her, the last of the pirates passed within that invisible boundary as well. They were all totally committed to this battle now. Neither the attackers nor the defenders would be leaving Exocron until one side or the other had been destroyed. Here they come, David murmured. Shada looked at him, a bitter retort bubbling in her throat. Of course they were coming. And abruptly, his Ishi snarled in disbelief. Shada snapped her attention back to the viewports. The pirates were still there, still coming. But they weren't the ones David had been referring to. Behind the pirates' line, something else had appeared. It was a spaceship, of course, but it was a ship like nothing Shada had ever seen. Roughly ovoid, half again as big as the Marauders, it was covered with thick hull plates that gave it the appearance of some sort of armored sea creature. Conical projections, possibly exhaust ports or thruster pods, jutted out from the hull with no symmetry or pattern that Shada could spot. A magnified image popped up on one of the displays, showing an intricate array of symbols and alien glyphs covering the hull. At close range, the hull itself looked disturbingly like something alive. Someone on the bridge swore, very quietly. Shada looked at the viewport again, just in time to see 3 more of the ships wink into existence. Not jump in with the characteristic flicker of pseudo-motion of a normal hyperspace jump, but simply appear. And then, almost casually, the first alien ship drove up behind one of Raikas's Marauders, and with a glittering filigreed sheet of blue-green energy discharge, sliced it in half. His Ishi snarled. "What are these?" she demanded. "They're called the Yang-Ti monks," David said, his tone a strange mixture of satisfaction and awe. "Alien beings who spend most of their lives near the Cathal Rift. There's not a lot we know about them." "Yet they're coming to your aid," Card pointed out. "More significantly, you knew they would." "They hate slavers," David said. "Raycos is a slaver. It's very simple." A second marauder flashed with fire and streaming air as one of the other Ang-Ti ships sent another of the strange flower blossoms of energy through its side. Ahead of the wrecked ships, the confident battle line collapsed as the remaining attackers swung around to face this new threat that had appeared so unexpectedly behind them. But to no avail. The Ang-Ti ships shrugged off the frantic turbolaser fire with ease as they systematically drove through the attackers' ranks, cutting up the larger ships and crushing the smaller ones against their own hulls. "I'm afraid it's not quite that simple, Admiral," Card said to David. "According to Bombassa, Raycos has been setting up in this area for the past year. Why did your Ang-Ti wait this long to move against them?" "As I said, they prefer to stay near the rift," David said. "It takes something special to make them come out even as far as Exocron." "In other words," Card said quietly, "you needed someone to lure Raycos into their territory. And that someone was us." David didn't move, but Shada could see a subtle new tension now in his face and posture. Perhaps pondering what would happen to him if a bridge full of hardened smugglers decided to be offended at having been used as bait. "It was your actions we used, Captain Card," he said. "Your decision to come to Exocron, and your inability to keep Raycas's people from tracking you. It wasn't you personally we were using." His eyes flicked around the bridge. "Not any of you." For a long moment the bridge was silent. Shada looked back at the viewport to find the destruction of the pirates nearly complete. Only 3 of the Ang-Ti were visible now, and as she watched another of them winked out, leaving as mysteriously as it had arrived. The last 2 alien ships stayed just long enough to finish their task before they too vanished into the darkness. "You say 'we,'" Card said. "Is that just you and the rest of the Exocron military?" "That's an odd question," David said obliquely. "Who else could be involved?" "Who indeed?" Card murmured. "Chin, open a transmission frequency to the surface. 3PO, I want a message translated into Old Tarmidian for me." Shada looked up at him. Card's face was carved from stone, his expression unreadable. Old Tarmidian? She asked, frowning. Cardassa's language? He nodded. Here's the message, 3PO. This is Card. I'd like permission to come down and see you again. Of course, Captain Card, 3PO said, moving uncertainly over towards the comm station. Chin nodded, and the droid leaned over his shoulder. Mereo Card Tuleak, he said. Muparilene Stafurinade Moa Sud Papore. He looked back at Card. You understand, of course, that there may not be an answer for some time. Sapo Bruce Tai, a voice boomed from the speaker, making the droid jump. A strong, vibrant voice with no hint of weakness or illness. Shada looked up at Card again, to find his stone-like expression had hardened even further. Translation? He asked. 3PO seemed to brace himself. He said, sir, come ahead. Entoni was waiting for them as the wild card put down again in Circle 15 of the Rentada City's landing field. His casual manner, his cheerful chatter, and the land speeder ride along with Shada and 3PO towards the pale blue house against the mountain were like a ghostly repetition of Card's last trip through the area a few hours earlier. But there was one big difference. Then the driving emotions behind his mood had been fear and dread and the morbid contemplation of his own looming death. Now he wasn't sure what his mood was. Puzzlement and uncertainty, perhaps, tinged with a hint of resentment at having been twitched along like a puppet. And overlaying it all, a renewed haze of dread. Cardass, he couldn't help remembering, had always spoken fondly of predators who played with their prey before finally killing them. The blue house itself was unchanged, just as old and sagging and dusty as it had been before. But as Entuni led the way to the bedroom door, Card noted that the odor of age and sickness had vanished. And this time the door opened by itself as they approached. Steeling himself, only vaguely aware that Shada had deftly inserted a shoulder in front of him, the two of them together stepped through the door. The built-in shelves with all their useless knickknacks and exotic medical supplies were gone. The sickbed and its stacks of blankets were gone. And standing where the bed had been, still just as old, but now as vitally alive as he had been feeble then, was George Cardass. Hello, Card, Cardass said, the vast network of facial wrinkles shifting as he smiled. It's good to see you again. Not that it's been all that long, Card said stiffly. I congratulate you on your amazing recovery. The smile didn't even falter. You're angry with me, of course, Cardass said calmly. I understand that, but it'll all become clear soon. In the meantime... He half turned and waved at the back wall, and abruptly the wall was no longer there. In its place was a long tunnel equipped with 4 guide rails that faded off into the distance. Just beyond where the wall had been, an enclosed quadrail car was waiting. Let me take you across to my real home, Cardass continued. It's much more comfortable than this place. He waved a hand towards the car, and a side door swung invitingly open in response. Please, after you. Card looked at the open door, an odd tightness squeezing his heart. Predators playing with their prey. Why don't just you and I go, he offered instead. Shada and 3PO can return to the wild card. No, Shada cut him off firmly. You want to show someone around, Cardass, you take me. Then if I decide it's safe, I'll consider letting Card join us. Really, Cardass said, regarding her with such obvious amusement that Card found himself cringing. Being amused at someone like Shada wasn't an especially healthy thing to do. Such quick and short-tempered loyalty you inspire in your people, Card. She's not one of my people, Card told him quickly. She was asked to come along by High Counselor Leia Organa Solo of the New Republic. She has absolutely nothing to do with me or with anything I might have done in the past. Please, Cardass interrupted, holding up a hand. I admit this is highly entertaining to watch, but in all seriousness, you're both worrying about nothing. He looked Card straight in the eye. I'm not the man you once knew, Talon, he said quietly. Please give me the chance to prove that. Card let his eyes drift away from that unblinking gaze. Predators playing with their prey. But if Cardass truly wanted them dead, it didn't really matter whether they played along or not. All right, he said. Come on, Shada. Excuse me, sir, 3PO spoke up hesitantly. I presume you won't be needing me any further? No, no, please, Cardass said, waving the droid forward. I'd love to sit down later and have a chat with you. It's been such a long time since I've had anyone I could speak Old Tarmidian with. He smiled over at Entuni. Entuni tries, but it's not the same. Not really, no, Entuni conceded regretfully. So please join us, Cardass added to 3PO. By the way, you don't also happen to know the Cincher dialectory, do you? 3PO seemed to brighten. Of course I do, sir, he said, pride temporarily superseding nervousness. I am fluent in over 6 million. Excellent, Cardass said. Let's be going then. A minute later, they were all in the quadrail car, spinning smoothly down the tunnel. I mostly keep to myself these days, Cardass commented. But occasionally I still need to deal with Exocron officialdom. I use that house back there for such meetings. It's convenient and keeps them from being overawed by my real home. They know who you are? Shada asked, her tone just short of a demand. I mean who you really are. Cardass shrugged. They have bits and pieces of my past, he said. But as you'll soon see, much of that history is now irrelevant. Well, before we get to history, let's try some current events, Shada said, starting with these Ang-Ti monks of yours. David can spin his anti-slaver slant all he wants, but we all know there's more to it than that. You called them in, didn't you? The Ang-Ti and I have had some dealings together, Cardass agreed soberly, his wrinkled face thoughtful. Abruptly he smiled. But that's history again, isn't it? All in its proper time. Fine, Shada said. Let's try again. David says you didn't use us to lure Rakos in. I say you did. Cardass looked at Card. I like her, Talon, he declared. She has a fine spirit. He shifted his eyes to Shada. I don't suppose you'd be interested in a new job, would you? I wasted a dozen years with a smuggling gang, Cardass, Shada growled. I'm not interested in joining another. Ah, he said with a nod. Forgive me. Here we are. The tunnel had come to an end in a small, well-lighted room. Cardass popped the door and bounded out as the quadrail slid smoothly to a stop. Come, come, he urged the others. You're going to love this place, Talon. You really are. All ready? Let's go. Almost bouncing with childlike anticipation, he led the way to an archway-topped door. He waved his hand as he approached, and as the wall of the blue house had done, the door simply vanished. And stretched out beyond the doorway was a dream world. Card stepped through, his first impression being that they had stepped out into the open air into a meticulously tended garden. Directly in front of them was a wide expanse of flowers and small plants and shrubs, all carefully and artistically arranged, stretching for perhaps 100 meters ahead of them. A winding path led through the garden, with stone benches set at various points along it. At its side edges, the garden gave way to a forest of tall trees and dozens of different species, with leaves whose colors varied from dark blue to brilliant red. From somewhere within the forest came the bubbling sound of water running over a rock-bottom creek, but from their position, he couldn't see where it was. It wasn't until he followed the tallest tree up to their tops that he spotted the sky-blue dome above them. A dome that flowed down into unobtrusive walls behind the stands of trees. Yes, it's all inside, Cardass confirmed. Very much inside, in fact. We're under one of the mountains to the east of Rintata City. Beautiful, isn't it? You tend it yourself? Card asked. I do most of the work, Cardass said, starting forward towards the path. But there are a few others as well. This way. He led them through the garden to a concealed door between two red-trunked trees on the far side. Must have been a big job putting all of this together, Shada commented as the door again vanished at a wave of Cardass's hand. Your Ang-Ti friends help? In an indirect way, yes, Cardass said. This is my conversation room, as beautiful as the garden in its own way. Yes, Card agreed, looking around. The conversation room was laid out in more or less classic High Alderaanian style, done up in dark wood and intertwined plants, with the same feeling of expansiveness as the garden outside. What did you mean by indirect help? It's rather ironic, really, Cardass said, angling off through the conversation room towards a door to their right. When I arrived on Exocron, I started building my home under these mountains purely for defensive reasons. Now that defense is no longer an issue, I find I enjoy the place for its solitude. Card glanced at Shada. Defense no longer an issue? Was Raykas that much of a threat? Cardos frowned. Raykas? Oh, no, Talon, you misunderstand. Raykas was a threat, certainly, but only to the rest of Exocron. I helped get rid of him in order to protect my neighbors, but I myself was in no danger at all. Come, you'll particularly want to see this. He waved the door away and gestured them forward. Card stepped inside and stopped in amazement. He was standing at the outer rim of a circular room that appeared to be even bigger across than the garden they'd just left. The floor of the room dipped, amphitheater fashion, towards the center, where he could see the edge of what looked like a workstation or computer desk. Arrayed in concentric circles around the desk, with only narrow walkways separating them, were circle after circle of 2-meter high data cases. And filling each of the shelves on each of the data cases were data cards. Thousands and thousands of data cards. Knowledge, Talon, Cardass said quietly from beside him. Information. My passion wants. My weapon in my defense and my comfort. He shook his head. Amazing, isn't it? What we sometimes persuade ourselves are the most important things in life. Yes, Card murmured. Cardass's library. And the Kamas document. So Antony lied to us, Shada spoke up, the edge in her voice cutting into Card's sense of wonder. He said he didn't know what happened to your library. Antony, Cardass called. Did you lie to them? Not at all, George, Antony's distant voice protested from behind them. Card turned to see the little man still on the far side of the conversation room, busying himself with drinks. I merely said that whatever you had done with it had been done before I came to be in your service. Which is perfectly true, Cardass agreed, gesturing them back out of the library. But come sit down. I know you have so many questions. Let me start with the most important one, Card said, not moving. The reason we came here was to look for a vitally important historical document. It involves... Yes, I know, Cardass said with a sigh. The Kamas document. You know about that? Shada asked. I'm not the frail, bedridden old man you met a few hours ago, Cardass reminded her mildly. I still have a few sources of information, and I try to keep in touch with what's happening back home. He shook his head. Unfortunately, I can't help you. As soon as the Kamas matter first broke, I checked through all the files to see if I had a copy, but I'm afraid I don't. Card felt his heart sink. You're absolutely sure? Cardass nodded. Yes. I'm sorry. Card nodded back. After all the work and danger in getting here, there it was, the end of the road, and it's finished with an empty hand. Shada wasn't ready to let it go quite that easily. And what if you had found a copy? She demanded. You can talk all you want about keeping in touch, but the fact is that for the past 20 years you've been taking it easy out here and letting everyone else do all the work. Cardass lifted his eyebrows. Suspicious and unforgiving both, he commented. That's rather sad. Isn't there anyone or anything you trust? I'm a professional bodyguard, Shada bit out. Trust isn't part of the job. And don't try to change the subject. You sat out the whole rebellion, not to mention Thrawn's first bid for power. Why? Something unreadable flicked across Cardass's face. Thrawn, he murmured, his eyes sweeping slowly around his library. A most interesting person indeed. I have most of his history with the Empire on file here, Pulled it all out recently, reading through it. There's more to his story than meets the eye. I'm convinced of it. Far more. You still haven't answered my question, Shada said. Cardass lifted his eyebrows. I wasn't aware you'd asked one, he said. All I heard were accusations that I'd been letting others do all the work. But if that was intended as a question, he smiled. I suppose it's true in a way, but only in a way. I merely let others do their work while I've been doing mine. But come, Antony's ruckstick will be getting cold. He led the way across the conversation room to the sunken circle. Antony was waiting patiently there, his now loaded tray set on a pillar table. What have you told the lady about me, Talon? Cardass asked as he gestured the two of them to seats on one side of the circle. Just to avoid repeating things. I've told her the basics, Card said, gingerly sitting down. Despite all of the geniality and surface friendliness, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something going on below the surface. How you started the organization, then abruptly left 20 years ago. And did you tell her about my kidnapping by the Bafashi Dark Jedi? Cardass asked, his tone subtly odd. That's where it all really began. Card threw a glance at Shada. I mentioned it, yes. Cardass sighed, not looking up at Antony as the latter put a steaming cup into his hands. It was a terrible experience, he said quietly, gazing into the cup. Possibly the first time in my life I'd felt truly and genuinely terrified. He was half mad with rage, maybe more than half mad, with all of Darth Vader's power and none of his self-control. One of my crewmen he physically ripped to shreds, literally tearing his body apart. The other three he took over mentally, twisting and searing their minds and turning them into little more than living extensions of himself. Me? He took a careful sip of his drink. Me, he left mostly alone, he continued. I'm still not sure why, unless he thought he might need my knowledge of ports and space lanes to make his escape. Or perhaps he simply wanted an intact mind left aboard who could recognize his power and greatness and be properly frightened by it. He sipped again. We headed across the space lanes, dodging or avoiding the forces gathering against him. I thought up scheme after scheme to defeat him as we traveled, none of which ever made it past the planning stage for the simple reason that he knew about each of them almost before I did. I got the feeling that my pitiful efforts greatly amused him. Finally, for reasons I still don't entirely understand, we made for a little backwater system not even important enough to make it onto most of the charts. A planet with nothing but swamps and dank forests and frozen slush. A planet named Dagobah. There was a whiff of some exotic spice from Card's side, and he looked up to see Antony hand him his cup. The little man's usual cheerful expression had vanished, replaced by a profound seriousness Card had never seen in him before. I don't know if the Dark Jedi expected to be all alone down there, Cardass went on. But if he did, he was quickly disappointed. We'd barely stepped outside the ship when we spotted the funny-looking little creature with big pointed ears standing at the edge of the clearing where we'd put down. He was a Jedi Master named Yoda. I don't know whether that was his home or whether he had just flown in occasionally for the occasion. What I do know is that he was definitely waiting for us. An odd shiver ran through Cardass's thin body. I won't try to describe their battle, he said in a low voice. Even after 45 years of thinking about it, I'm not sure I can. For nearly a day and a half, the swamp blazed with fire and lightning and things I still don't understand. At the end of it, the Dark Jedi was dead, disintegrating in a final massive blaze of blue fire. He took a shuddering breath. None of my crew survived that battle. Not that there was much left of what they'd been, anyway. I didn't expect to survive either, but to my surprise, Yoda took it upon himself to nurse me back to life. Card nodded. I've seen a little of what Luke Skywalker can do with healing trances, he said. Better than Bacta in some cases. Cardass snorted. In my case, Bacta would have been completely useless, he stated flatly. As it was, it took Yoda quite a while to return me to health. I still don't know how long. Afterward, I was able to jury-rig the ship well enough to get it spaceworthy and limp home. It wasn't until I was back with the organization that I began to realize that somewhere in that whole procedure, some part of me had been changed. He looked at Card. I'm sure you remember, Talon. I seem to have gained the ability to outthink my opponents, to guess their strategies and plans, to know when one of them was plotting a move against me. Abilities I assumed I'd somehow absorbed from Yoda during the healing process. He looked up at the ceiling, a new fire in his eyes and voice. And suddenly there were no limits to what I could do. None. I began expanding the organization, swallowing up any group that seemed potentially useful and eliminating everyone that didn't. Victory after victory after victory. Everywhere I went, I conquered. I saw the Hutt's criminal cartels and planned how I would take them down, foresaw the gathering of power around Senator Palpatine, and considered where and how I could best insert myself into the coming struggle for my own advantage. There was literally nothing that could stop me, and I and the universe both knew it. Abruptly, the fire faded away. And then, he said quietly, without warning, everything suddenly collapsed. He took a long drink from his cup. What happened? Shada asked into the silence. Card stole a look at her, mildly surprised at the intense concentration in her expression. Despite all her professed distrust of Cardass himself, she clearly found his story riveting. My health fell apart, Cardass said. Over a period of just a few weeks, all the youth and vigor that Yoda's healing had woven into my body seemed to evaporate. He looked at Shada. Very simply, I was dying. Card nodded, the last mystery of that beacon call lying abandoned in the Dagobah swamp suddenly falling into place. And so you went back to Yoda and asked for help. Asked? Cardass gave a short, self-deprecating laugh. Not asked, Talon. Demanded. He shook his head at the memory. It must have looked quite absurd, really. There I stood, towering over him with a blaster in one hand and my beacon call in the other, threatening to bring my ship and all its awesome weaponry to bear on this short, wizened creature leaning on a staff in front of me. Of course, I was the single-handed creator of the greatest smuggling organization of all time, while he was nothing but a simple little Jedi master. He shook his head again. I'm surprised he didn't kill you on the spot, Shada said. At the time, I almost wished he had, Cardass said ruefully. It would have been far less humiliating. Instead, he simply took the beacon call and blaster away from me and sent them spinning off into the swamp, then held me suspended a few centimeters above the ground and let me scream and flail to my heart's content. And when I finally ran out of strength and breath, he told me I was going to die. Antony stepped up to his side, silently pouring more of the spice drink into his cup. I thought the first part had been humiliating, Cardass went on. The next part was worse. As I sat there panting on a rock, swamp water seeping into my boots, he told me in exquisitely painful detail just how badly I'd squandered the gift of life he'd given back to me a quarter century earlier. How my utterly selfish pursuit of personal power and aggrandizement had left me empty of spirit and vacant of purpose. He looked at Card. By the time he finished, I knew I could never go back, that I could never ever face any of you again. Card looked down at his cup, suddenly aware he was gripping it tightly. Then you didn't. I mean, you weren't angry with you? Cardass smiled at him. On the contrary, old friend, you were the single bright spot in the whole painful mess. For the first time since I'd left Dagobah, I found myself thinking about all the people in my organization. People who I'd now abandoned to the viciousness of internecine warfare as my lieutenants, most of them as selfish as I was, fought for their individual slices of the fat Brualki I'd created. He shook his head, his old eyes almost misty. I didn't hate you for taking over, Talon. Far from it. You held the organization together, treating my people with the dignity and respect they deserved. The dignity and respect I'd never bothered to give them. You transformed my selfish ambition into something to be proud of, and for 20 years I've wanted to thank you for that. And to Card's surprise, he stood up and crossed the circle. Thank you, he said simply, holding out his hand. Card stood up, a terrible weight lifting from his shoulders. You're welcome, he murmured, gripping the extended hand. I just wish I'd known sooner. I know, Cardass said, letting go and returning to his seat. But as I said, for the first few years I was too ashamed to even face you. And then later, when your Mara Jade and Lando Calrissian came sniffing around, I assumed you would soon be showing up yourself. I should have, Card conceded, but I wasn't exactly eager to do so. I understand, Cardass said. It's as much my fault as it was yours. He waved a hand. Still, as it turned out, your arrival was just what we needed to eliminate the threat of Raikas and his pirates. He pointed towards the ceiling. That's one of the many things I've been learning from the Yang Ti, in fact. Though not all is predetermined, all is somehow still being guided. I still don't quite understand that, but I'm working on it. Sounds like something a Jedi would say, Card suggested. Similar, but not the same, Cardass agreed. The Yang Ti have an understanding of the Force, but it's a different understanding from that of the Jedi. Or perhaps it's merely a different aspect of the Force that they relate to. I'm not really sure which. Yoda couldn't heal me, you see. Or rather, didn't have the time the task would require. He told me he needed to prepare for what he said was possibly the most important instruction he had had for the past 100 years. Card nodded, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. Luke Skywalker. Was it him? Cardass asked. I've always suspected that, but was never able to confirm he actually trained on Dagobah. At any rate, Yoda said my only chance to postpone my death was to seek out the Yang Ti monks of the Cathal Rift, who might be willing to help me. Card gestured towards him. Obviously they did. Oh, yes, they did, Cardass said, his mouth twisting wryly. But at what a price! Card frowned, a shiver running through him. What kind of price? Cardass smiled. Nothing less than my life, Talon, he said. My life to be spent learning their ways of the Force. He held up a hand. Don't misunderstand me, please. It wasn't their demand, but my choice. All my life, you see, I've relished challenges. The bigger the better. Once I'd gotten a taste of what they had discovered out here. He waved his hand around the room. It was the biggest challenge I'd ever faced. How could I pass it up? I thought you needed a certain amount of inborn aptitude to be a Jedi, Shada pointed out. A Jedi, perhaps, Cardass nodded. But as I said, the Yang Ti have a different view of the Force. Not in terms of Jedi and Dark Jedi, of black and white, as it were, but in the way I like to think of it as a full-color rainbow. Here, let me show you. Would you move your tray, please, Antony? The little man picked up the tray, leaving the pillar table empty, as Cardass set his cup down on the floor in front of him. Now watch, he said, rubbing his hands together. Let's see if I can do this. He settled his shoulders and gazed hard at the pillar table. And abruptly, with a sharp pop of displaced air, a small crystalline decanter appeared. Card jerked violently, his drink sloshing up the side of his cup, and over the edge onto his fingers. Never in any of his dealings with Skywalker or Mara had he seen anything like that. It's all right, Cardass said hastily. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. You created that? Shada asked, her voice sounding stunned. No, no, of course not, Cardass assured her. I merely moved it in here from the cooking area. One of the little tricks the Yang Ti taught me. The idea is to see the room and then envision it with the decanter already here. He broke off, retrieving his cup and getting to his feet. I'm sorry. I could go on all day about the Yang Ti and the Force, but you're both tired, and I'm neglecting my duties as host. Let me show you to your rooms and let you relax for a while I see about a meal. It's very kind of you, Card said, standing up and shaking the drops of spice drink off his fingers. But I'm afraid we have to leave. If you can't provide us with the Kamas document, we need to start back to the New Republic space right away. I understand your commitments and obligations, Talon, Cardass said, but you can certainly afford to take one night just to relax. I wish we could, Card said, trying not to sound too impatient. I really do, but besides, if you leave now, it'll actually take you much longer to get home, Cardass added. I've spoken to the Yang T, and they've agreed to send a ship tomorrow to carry the wild card anywhere you want to go. And how does that gain us anything? Shada asked. It gains you because their star drive is considerably different from ours, Cardass told her. As you may have noticed from the battle, instead of using the usual hyperspace travel, their ships are able to make an instantaneous jump to whatever point they wish to go. Card looked at Shada. You were on the spotter scopes, he said. Was that what they were doing? She shrugged. It's as good an explanation as any, she conceded. I know Hisishi scrubbed the data and she couldn't figure out what had happened either. She looked suspiciously at Cardass. So why can't they do this for us now? Because I told them you wouldn't need the ship until morning, Cardass said with a smile. Come now, indulge an old man's desire for company, won't you? I'm sure your crew could use a good night's rest, too. After all, they've been through on this trip. Card shook his head in defeat. Still a master manipulator, aren't you, George? The smile widened. A man can only change so much, he said genially. And while they're freshening up, he added, shifting his eyes to 3PO, you can come help me cook while we have our talk. Certainly, sir, 3PO said brightly. Do you know, I have become quite a fair chef during my service to Princess Leia and her family. Wonderful, Cardass said. Perhaps you could teach me some of your culinary expertise. Why don't you call your ship, Talon, and tell them to settle down until morning? And then I'll show you and the lady to your rooms. That's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.